Why stabilizing Venezuela is a fantasy. Knowing the steps is not the same thing as being able to carry them out. Let me repeat that. Knowing the steps is not the same thing as being able to carry them out. When people talk about stabilizing Venezuela, they usually mean a familiar sequence: restore security, restart oil production, and install a legitimate government. On paper, those steps are clear. Each of those steps requires enormous amounts of money and highly specialized technical expertise, and Venezuela lacks both at scale. But even if those resources were suddenly available, they would not solve the core problem. The binding constraint is people, individuals who can exercise authority, command trust, enforce rules, and survive long enough to do the job. Without that, stabilization isn't a plan, it's just a slogan. Security is not created by good administrators or well-written laws. It is created by whoever can reliably control armed actors. In Venezuela, that means the military, the police, intelligence services, and irregular armed groups, plus any foreign forces on the ground. If the United States were to run the country, as Trump says he will do, there are really only two options available. The first is a large, sustained security presence, an occupation in everything but name. The second is building and financing a local coercive apparatus. By that, I mean the people with guns who enforce order day to day. Army units that control territory. Police who decide who gets arrested and who doesn't. Intelligence services that monitor opposition, and often militias that fill the gaps where the state is weak. Not laws, not elections, not ministries. People with weapons, paychecks, and permission to use force. We have seen this model before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Libya, earlier in Somalia. Different places, different justifications, same structural problem. Security imposed from the outside either generates long-term blowback or collapses the moment the external force pulls back, and often it produces both. Venezuela's oil is often treated as the escape hatch. The reason this case is different. But oil recovery does not happen because the country needs revenue. It happens when engineers, capital, logistics, and security operate under enforceable rules. Those people exist globally. They are competent, and they do not work on patriotism. They work under contracts. They price risk, and when rule of law is weak, they demand protection. That pushes you toward a familiar outcome: extraction under guard. At that point, oil does not stabilize the country. It stabilizes whoever controls the revenue stream, and often deepens corruption rather than curing it. This is not theoretical. We have watched versions of this dynamic play out repeatedly in post-conflict states. This is where most stabilization efforts fail. You cannot import legitimacy. You can recognize an existing domestic coalition that already has credibility, or you can try to manufacture one. The second option almost never works. In Venezuela, any real legitimacy would have to come from Venezuelans themselves. Opposition factions with credibility, technocrats, civil society, church networks, municipal leaders, and possibly dissident Chavistas. But the moment those actors are perceived as foreign installed, their legitimacy collapses. We've learned this lesson the expensive way. In Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, where local leaders quickly came to be seen as intermediaries rather than representatives. Foreign control does not create legitimacy, it destroys it. People often ask, where are the courageous, competent, high-integrity individuals in Venezuela? They exist. But integrity only survives if three protections exist at the same time: physical safety, institutional insulation, and transparent revenue flows. Absent all three of those protections, integrity becomes a liability. In broken systems, the people who rise are not the best. They are the most compliant, the most connected, or the most ruthless. That is why nation-building efforts so often empower exactly the kinds of actors they claim to oppose. If there were a uniquely credible Venezuelan transitional coalition ready to govern immediately, and if the United States were willing to maintain a costly security posture long enough for that coalition to become self-sustaining, this story could look different. That combination is historically rare. Absent it, failure is not a worst-case scenario. It is the default outcome. And the risk does not stop at Venezuela. When powerful countries normalize regime control without legitimacy, the rule is no longer that this is an exception. The rule becomes that exceptions are available to those strong enough to take them. That is how rules erode, not all at once, but case by case. Knowing the steps is not the same thing as being able to carry them out. Let me say it again. Knowing the steps is not the same thing as being able to carry them out. Confusing the two has already cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and decades of instability. Venezuela would not be the first place where we relearn this lesson, but it would be one more.